Tonight, we go to a quieter place, one less documented, more whispered about. The year is 1761, and we are walking the moss-lined lanes of County Kilkenny, Ireland, just after dusk. You can almost smell the peat smoke curling from low chimneys, and hear the crows cawing across the misty fields. But there's another kind of silence here, one that doesn't come from peace, but from absence. Because in this part of rural Ireland, entire families once vanished without a trace, and the ledgers always said the same thing: evicted due to unpaid rent. But what if they hadn't left at all? What if their names were quietly buried in something other than paper? The Crows were not known for kindness, though no one dared say that aloud. Brigid Crow had been widowed young. She ran a small farming estate inherited from her late husband's 6 tenant cottages, a livestock barn, a smokehouse, and a stony manor that looked more like a fortress than a home. Her 3 sons, Declan, Fergus, and Liam, rarely came into town, and when they did, their boots tracked mud, and their eyes held no welcome. Locals said they talked to no one but their mother, and always in whispers. Yet for all their coldness, the Crow property was functional. Vegetables grew in neat rows. The cattle were lean, but healthy. The rent was collected on time, at least at first. Tenant farmers were poor, often scraping to pay a few shillings each quarter. But in the ledgers Brigid Crow maintained, the stories were consistent. This one couldn't pay. That one left in the night. Another moved to Dublin without notice. It was a strange pattern. But no one questioned it, at least not until the schoolmaster vanished. Mr. Duffy was not a tenant. He had no land, no debt, and no reason to quarrel with the Crows. He simply taught letters to the children of the nearby parishes. But one spring morning, he went missing. His little cottage stood empty, the bed untouched, his ink bottles full, the hearth cold. His last known visit, Brigid Crow's estate. He had gone to collect a few books lent to her sons. He never returned. When the constable came asking, Brigid shrugged. He never arrived, she said plainly. Her sons stood behind her, silent as posts. No one pressed further. The schoolmaster, it was assumed, had wandered off. A few believed he'd taken a steamer for Liverpool. His name was eventually removed from the church roll. Life in the village moved on, slowly and uneasily. Then came the harvest storm. That August, rain fell for 11 days. Fields flooded. Potatoes rotted in the earth. A tenant family named the McGraths missed rent. Brigid gave no warning, no offer of grace. Instead, she arrived in her cart with 2 of her sons and told them to vacate within a day. That night, the McGraths were seen loading their cart by lantern light. They waved to a neighbor, said they would stay with relatives in Tipperary, but they never arrived, and no one saw them again. Strangely, the cottage was never boarded up. A week later, smoke was seen rising from the chimney. Chickens were heard in the yard. When asked, Brigid claimed she had new tenants, a couple from Cork, yet no one met them. No one heard their names, and when a priest stopped by to deliver communion, he was turned away. Whispers began to circulate at the mill and the parish pump. Some said the Crows were hiding something. Others claimed it was all nonsense, just poverty, bad luck, and the usual churn of rural life. But the records told a stranger tale. Over a 5-year span, 11 tenants had vanished from the Crow estate. None had turned up in other towns. None had claimed church charity. And in each case, Brigid had filed the same notice: property reclaimed due to desertion. One evening, an old cobbler named Shane found something odd while walking the hedgerow. Between fields, a copper locket, half buried in the mud. Inside, a painted miniature of a young woman, Mary McGrath, unmistakably. Shane had made her wedding shoes just 2 years earlier. He brought the locket to the priest, who said a quiet prayer and placed it in a drawer. A week later, the priest was dead. Heart failure, they said. But Shane never spoke again of what he'd found. Some blamed the famine years. Others the quiet brutality of Irish landlordism. But a few began to keep their distance from the Crows altogether. No more borrowing tools. No more friendly visits. Even the cattle drover stopped riding past their lands. There was a hollowness in that part of Kilkenny, a quietness that seemed to grow with each vacancy. Recorded in Brigid's precise handwriting, But who would investigate? In that era, rural Ireland was a land of silence, especially when it came to landlords. Brigid Crow held papers from her husband's will. She paid her tithes. She hosted a constable for dinner each Michaelmas, and her sons, they buried something. Behind the barn every third month, neighbors swore. Spoiled potatoes, Brigid would claim. But there was never a smell of rot, only turned earth, packed flat by heavy boots. What truly happened to those tenants? Were they driven out by fear, hunger, or something colder? And how could so many disappear without a single body ever found? The priest who died with Mary McGrath's locket tucked away in his drawer. Was Father Keane a quiet man, well past 60, with a fondness for lemon biscuits and precise scripture? He rarely stirred trouble, but in his final weeks, he had grown. Increasingly uneasy, he had begun asking questions in confidence about the McGraths, about the other missing tenants, and even about Brigid Crow's tithe schedule. In his last sermon, he spoke softly, but with conviction. Let not the silence of the righteous become shelter for the wicked. Most thought it was a general reflection. Some, though, remembered. After his death, the locket vanished from the parish house. No record was made of it. No one claimed it. His successor, a younger and more cautious priest, chose not to revisit the subject. By then, talk of the missing had become as dangerous as the missing themselves. It wasn't only the poor who disappeared eventually. It was those who asked too many questions. Constable Merrigan, the man who had once dined annually at the Crow estate, began to take notice of the pattern privately at first. He had seen Brigid's ledger with his own eyes. She kept it herself. A bound volume, dates written in a sharp, controlled hand. She was meticulous, perhaps too meticulous, and always the same phrases. Tenant fled in night. No forwarding location. Property returned to landlord. But Merrigan remembered the Higgins family, who had hosted harvest feasts for 10 years running before they fled. He remembered the laughter of their children, the smell of their onion stew. They would not have left without notice, and yet their cottage, just like the others, was relet within days. New tenants, always from elsewhere, always faceless, always unreachable. Merrigan made one quiet attempt to investigate. He told no one, not even his wife. On a cloudless morning in late April, he rode out alone to the Crow property, claiming a need to inspect tenancy rolls for taxation. Brigid welcomed him on the porch with a cup of weak tea. Her sons stood at a distance, hoeing the garden, or pretending to. She offered the ledger without being asked. It was what he found tucked inside the cover that changed everything. A folded map, hand-drawn. Faint marks along the property line, like old gravestone etchings. Most curious was a section near the eastern wood, labeled only with an M. No building existed there, but the ground was cleared. Merrigan asked her what M meant. Mulch pit, she replied, without blinking, for the kitchen waste. We grow cabbages there in summer. He returned the map, thanked her for her time, and rode home with a stomach full of knots. That evening, he drafted a report. It was never submitted. He fell the next day, an aggressive fever, they said. 2 weeks later, he was buried without inquiry. His wife said he'd begun waking in the night, whispering names of vanished tenants. One night, she found his boots by the door soaked with mud and something sticky, dark, and sweet smelling. With Merrigan gone, the Crows resumed their rhythm. Tenants came and went. No one stayed long, but no one challenged it. Locals became quieter. The baker delivered bread only to the edge of the Crow gate. Children crossed themselves when passing their land. No formal accusations were made. No headlines reached Dublin, but the whispers traveled. Some said Brigid was a hedge witch. Others said she'd made a deal with something older than God. But the truth was far more chilling. She had simply been left alone, with land, with sons, with the power to vanish those who lacked it. There were no elaborate rituals, no magic, just the slow, calculated erasure of the poor. One tenant, Mary O'Rourke, did survive her time at the Crow estate, but barely. She had lived in the smallest cottage, just for a season, a widow herself, with no children. She was the kind of tenant no one missed. But when her cow took ill and she couldn't pay the quarter's rent, She expected eviction. Instead, Brigid offered her work in the main house kitchen duty. She accepted, out of desperation. What Mara saw inside was never recorded in writing. But when she left fleeing in the dead of night with nothing but a shawl and a slice of cold bread, she was never seen near Kilkenny again. She was later found in a poorhouse in Limerick, half mad, whispering about root cellars that hummed and cabbage patches that bled. She died there before giving a full account. All she left behind was a charcoal sketch, a stone path ending at a cellar door, with 3 crosses etched into its wood, asterisk. Back in Kilkenny, Brigid continued to keep her ledger. Her sons married, but no one could say to whom. Their brides were never seen in church, and some swore the family line just folded inward generation after generation. Over time, the estate shrank. One son was lost in a fire, another in a river accident. The third simply stopped being seen. But Brigid lived on, into her 70s, into her 80s, always walking the same perimeter each morning, always wearing black. Asterisk by the time her estate passed to the county decades later, the cottages were abandoned, the house locked, the garden wild, and behind the barn, in that mulch pit, a team of modern surveyors discovered soil darker than it should have been, unnaturally rich, laced with old, brittle buttons and fragments of human bone. Asterisk but still, no bodies were officially exhumed. No charges were ever filed. The estate was sold to a farmer who raised the cottages and planted oats. The wind still hisses through the fields like distant footsteps, and locals still say, if you pass through Kilkenny and see a braid of garlic hanging from a gate, don't knock, don't ask questions, and never stay the night. Asterisk by the time Brigid Crow died, nearly no one in Kilkenny remembered the names of her vanished tenants. That was the most chilling part, how easily absence became normal. Her obituary in the parish records was brief, dispassionate. Brigid Crow, widow of Connell Crow, died in sleep, age, presumed 89, no known kin. Her sons were long gone by then, one lost to the bogs, another drowned in the Nore, and the third never confirmed alive or dead. No mourners came. The priest who buried her was not from Kilkenny, and the grave marker was just a stone, uncarved. Asterisk but the soil knew, and it held its secrets tightly, layer upon layer, beneath turnips and thistles, beneath bones worn smooth by time and frost. In the 1880s, the estate was bought by an English family who intended to modernize the land. They tore down what remained of the main house and rebuilt in stone and glass. Workers reported strange finds during excavation: old rusted keys, fragments of scorched wood, and once an iron ring bolted into the cellar floor. No one asked what it had anchored. Asterisk it wasn't until 1911 that someone finally kept record. An antiquarian named Dr. Coleman Hughes, hired to write a regional history, spent 2 summers documenting Kilkenny's oldest properties. He uncovered references in church ledgers to 11 families fleeing in the night. No letters sent, no burial records, only notations of unpaid tithes and quiet vanishings. He cross-referenced names with Dublin records. None reappeared. He visited the plot that once held the Crow estate, an oat field now, but the boundaries were still marked by the same hedgerows, grown wild and thorny. Asterisk he took soil samples. They came back rich in phosphate, far more than crop fertilizer would suggest. The readings were consistent with long-term decomposition. Hughes submitted his findings to a historical society in Waterford, suggesting the possibility of undocumented burials. The society replied politely, thanking him and closing the matter with a single sentence: "We have no jurisdiction over folklore." Asterisk but Hughes didn't let go. He kept digging, metaphorically and briefly, literally. One early morning, without permission, he and a local farmhand returned to the eastern edge of the property, the area marked M on the old map Merrigan had once seen. Beneath 6 inches of soil, they found a layer of charcoal. Beneath that, buttons, shoes, and bones. Asterisk the police were called. The site was sealed. And then, nothing. A brief notice appeared in the Kilkenny Times: remains found on private farmland, believed to be over a century old. No foul play suspected. No further details were released. The bones were sent to Dublin and never returned. Hughes was told the case was closed. He stopped publishing after that. Still, the rumors outlived the headlines. Children walking past the edge of the old field would say their names 3 times, daring each other to provoke the Crow widow. Sheep avoided the land. Birds circled high but never landed. The farmer who owned the land claimed his crops never grew well on that patch, even when the rest of the field flourished. He left it fallow after 1923, and that's how it remains a wild corner of earth that no plow touches. In time, the story faded. Rural history always does. The names of the vanished were forgotten, their stories buried with the ledgers. But if you ask the oldest men in Kilkenny, those who sit outside the pub with pipes and long memories, they might still tell you the Crows didn't just lose their tenants. They removed them, quietly, methodically, with no one to stop them. And perhaps most unsettling of all, no one really tried. Because when poverty knocks at the door, and power holds the key, the line between eviction and erasure becomes perilously thin. How many other estates buried their troubles beneath hedgerows and stones? How many fled in the night, only to be folded into the soil by those who held the deeds? And if the earth remembers what was done, how long before it chooses to whisper it again? 1611. Rome poison in the Psalms. The choirboy killer of San Clemente. There's a kind of beauty in church. Music that seems eternal, notes echoing off stone walls, voices blending in reverence, all wrapped in the hush of candlelight and incense. But in 17th century Rome, behind the marble pillars and gold-threaded vestments, something darker once slipped through the cracks, a voice just slightly off-pitch, a gaze that lingered too long, and a series of deaths that no one wanted to acknowledge because who would suspect a family whose livelihood depended on the sanctity of song? The Basilica of San Clemente, one of the oldest in Rome, stood modestly compared to its grander neighbors, but what it lacked in opulence, it made up for in history-layered foundations, dating back to the earliest Christians, catacombs beneath, and a choir school above. The basilica employed a small ensemble of choirboys, many orphaned or surrendered by impoverished families, raised on psalms, penance, and plain bread. They lived under the watchful eye of Maestro Giuliano, the basilica's choirmaster, and his 2 sons Marco and Elio. The Giuliano family had served the church for generations, their lineage traced back to composers and scribes, men who had dedicated their lives to sacred music. Maestro Giuliano himself had a commanding presence, tall, silver-haired, always in black. His sons, in contrast, were quiet. Marco, the elder, played the organ with mechanical perfection. Elio, younger by a decade, sang alto with a purity that moved even the stoniest monks to tears. Together, they ran the music program with rigid devotion. To rigid, some whispered. In 1611, a series of strange illnesses began to sweep through the choir school. It started with a boy named Pietro, 10 years old, sweet-voiced, with a talent for harmony. One morning, he collapsed during rehearsals, fevered, gasping, and dead by vespers. It was assumed to be plague. Rome was no stranger to illness, but no other cases followed in the city. Just the choir school. Then came Matteo, then Luca. Each fell ill in isolation. No common symptoms apart from a sudden weakness, stomach pain, and swift death. The bodies were buried quietly, funerals held before dawn. The church claimed contagion, but no quarantine was imposed. The choir continued. New boys arrived, more singing, more funerals. One boy, Angelo, survived barely, frail and tremulous. After his collapse, he was deemed unfit for the choir and returned to his distant relatives in Naples. There, in a fever dream, he confessed something unsettling to a local priest. He had once seen Elio Giuliano slip a powder into the sacramental wine meant for the choir's evening practice. When confronted, Elio denied it. The boy was dismissed as delusional. Nothing more was said. Angelo died 3 weeks later. No one returned for the burial. Inside San Clemente, the music continued. If the choir grew thinner, the sound became more haunting. Some parishioners claimed it felt empty, to precise, as if the boys no longer sang from faith, but from fear, and the Giulianos, ever composed, never wavered. The death slowed, and yet the unease lingered like cold incense. By winter's end, 5 choirboys had been buried, all between the ages of 9 and 12. Then came Brother Olivero, a former soldier turned monk. He had joined the basilica staff as a groundskeeper, but often lingered in the chapel. During rehearsals, he found solace in the harmonies, but he also noticed something others missed. The boys who fell ill were always the ones whose voices were changing, whose high notes had begun to strain, whose usefulness musically had begun to wane. He brought his suspicions to the bishop's assistant, a cautious man named Tommaso. Tommaso urged silence. "You are no physician," he said, "and they are no murderers. They are men of God." Still, Olivero persisted. He began keeping notes, watching, counting doses of wine and bread distributed during practice, observing Elio's movements. What he saw made him certain, but certainty is not safety. His notes vanished from his room one morning. The next day, his body was found in the cloister garden, slumped, peaceful, and holding a psalm book open to Psalm 94. They slay the widow and the stranger, and murder the fatherless. The official cause of death: exhaustion, overwork, a fragile heart. And so the Giulianos remained in place, unchallenged, unpunished, until a visiting Flemish composer, Peter van Laren, heard the rumors. He had come to Rome seeking inspiration, a sacred commission, but what he found in San Clemente disturbed him. "Their voices are to clean," he wrote in a letter, "as though they do not live outside the walls. No joy, no tremble, only terror shaped into sound." Van Laren's letters to colleagues in Antwerp hinted at poison, at spiritual abuse, at something far worse than silence. He left Rome abruptly. Within a year, he was dead, strangled in his sleep by an unknown intruder. His travel journals were never found. Only his final composition survived, Lacrimi Clemente, a mournful piece for boys' choir, in which every third measure repeats the word perdite, lost. No one dared investigate further. The church had its secrets, and the choir, after all, sang beautifully. But what happens when music masks the sound of death? When obedience becomes a kind of murder? And who will listen to the voices that have long since gone quiet? By the spring of 1612, the choir of San Clemente had become a thing of hushed legend. People traveled from surrounding parishes not just for the sermons, but for the music, the celestial clarity of the boys' voices. So hauntingly pure they seemed not quite human. Bishops praised it. Cardinals mentioned it in letters, and yet, those closest to the basilica avoided lingering after Mass. There was something in the air not foul, not even cold, just wrong, like a chord that resolved to neatly, like harmony without heart. Maestro Giuliano, now approaching 60, grew quieter still. His face seemed paler, his motions more stiff, but his reputation only rose. He was asked to contribute to a Vatican choral collection that year. Rome considered him a treasure. The deaths that had once rippled through the choir school had stopped. There had been no new burials since the passing of Brother Olivero. On the surface, all was well, and yet, within the choir school itself, something had changed. The boys rarely spoke unless spoken to. Their mealtimes were silent. They practiced obsessively 6 hours a day. Even when ill, any boy whose voice cracked was sent away, transferred, the Giulianos claimed, but their names were never mentioned again. A few of the younger boys whispered that those sent away were taken at night, that they never packed, that no wagons were seen, just shadows beneath cloaks, and the echo of footsteps through the cloister. One boy, however, did speak. His name was Nico, 11 years old, clever, with a slight stammer that disappeared when he sang. He had been brought to San Clemente by an aunt who hoped music would keep him safe. Nico began keeping notes in the margins of his psalm book. Small things at first: who coughed, who cried, which boys were dismissed and when. But slowly, he began to write what he saw. One entry read simply, "Brother Paolo wept today. Said don't take him. They took Marco anyway." Another, "Elio gave me a sugar drop after I asked about Matteo. I felt strange. Woke up late. Missed matins. Nico hid the psalmbook under a loose floor tile beneath his bed. He had no plans to tell anyone, only to remember. What he didn't know was that Elio Giuliano had noticed. The choirmaster's younger son was sharper than his. Blank stare suggested. He watched the boys closely, not just their posture and breath control, but their glances, their silences. He began assigning Nico solo parts more frequently. Praise in public, small gifts, a new feather quill, a slice of preserved orange. Elio, like his father, believed in correction through closeness. But Nico remained suspicious. One evening, he feigned sleep and watched as Elio crept into the dormitory. The young choirmaster opened drawers, lifted mattresses, gently turned pages in prayer books. When he reached Nico's bunk, he paused, then bent low to the floor. He found nothing. Nico had hidden the book elsewhere, but the message was clear. No secret was safe. That same week, the basilica prepared for a visiting delegation from Florence. The choir would perform at a special mass, a grand event, with incense, lace vestments, and noblemen in attendance. Elio insisted that Nico lead the final hymn, Domini non sum dignus. Nico agreed, but only after copying all of his notes into his second psalmbook and hiding it in the garden wall behind the chapel, beneath a loose brick worn soft by rain. The mass was a triumph. The choir sang flawlessly, but after the final hymn, Nico collapsed, not dramatically, just folded, as if something inside had been cut loose. He was carried out by the sacristan. The official report blamed fasting and nerves. He was said to have returned to his family the next day, but no carriage ever came, and the dormitory bed remained untouched. A week later, a gardener trimming the hedges behind the chapel found the brick loose. Curious, he removed it and found the psalmbook inside. At first, he took it to be forgotten devotional material, but as he flipped through the pages, he found the handwriting jagged, desperate. Names, dates, phrases like wine tasted strange again, and Elio smiled when Luca cried. The gardener, unsure what to do, brought the book to a parish deacon. The deacon never mentioned it again, but something shifted after that. The Giuliano family abruptly left San Clemente 2 months later. No farewell, no reassignment. Just gone. The choir school closed the following year for restructuring. The basilica returned to simpler chants. No more complex harmonies. No more soloists. Just plain Gregorian melody. Maestro Giuliano died in obscurity in 1615. In a small town north of Perugia, no funeral mass was held. His sons were never seen again. Rumors suggested one joined a monastery under a false name. Another died abroad. The Vatican made no statement. Rome moved on. New music, new composers, new scandals to ignore. But San Clemente changed. Visitors claimed the acoustics grew colder, the echo less warm. In the garden, a vine grew over the chapel wall where the psalmbook had been found. Its leaves were pale, almost gray, and never flowered. A new choir never formed. Yet sometimes, during evening prayers, an old sacristan would swear he heard a child's voice humming just outside the chapel wall. A single line from Domini non sum dignus, repeating in perfect pitch. 1903. Buenos Aires, the landlady of Kilkenny, Argentina's lost strangler Buenos Aires at the turn of the 20th century was a city of contradictions. Grand opera houses towered above unpaved alleys. Immigrants poured in from Italy, Spain, and Eastern Europe, lured by promises of land, but finding mostly overcrowded apartments and unstable work. The tango was taking form in the brothels. Wealth walked arm in arm with ruin, but beneath the surface of it all, down the narrower lanes, behind shuttered doors, lay stories that never made the history books. One of them begins on Kilkenny, in a boarding house where too many tenants checked in, and far too few ever left. The house wasn't remarkable. A 2-story home with peeling stucco, black iron grilles on the windows, and a rusted mailbox that bore no name. Locals referred to it simply as La Casa de la Viuda, the widow's house. No one could recall her actual surname, but everyone knew the landlady, an older woman with tightly braided hair, always in mourning black. who spoke with a Castilian lilt and carried a small ring of keys that jingled like a warning. Her full name, according to the lease ledgers, was Isidora Valverde. She ran the boarding house with the help of her nephew, Joaquin, a pale, weary boy of about 16, who did not speak unless spoken to. Isidora rarely left the property. Rent was collected through the door slot. Tenants were forbidden from inviting guests. The house rules, posted in 5 languages, stated plainly all doors must remain closed, windows locked, silence after 9 p.m. But the rent was cheap and the rooms dry. In 1903, that was enough. The disappearances began quietly. A Hungarian machinist vanished after his shift at the rail yard. Then a French teacher stopped showing up at the language school. Next, a Portuguese sailor was never seen boarding his ship. All 3 had been tenants at the house on Kilkenny. The police, overwhelmed by the city's growing unrest and lacking evidence, dismissed the cases as transients moving on without notice. Buenos Aires was full of people who came and went. But a reporter from El Diario de la Tarde, named Hernan Aguayo, took notice. He had an interest in the strange and a memory for patterns. He began tracing names, dates, and addresses. 10 tenants gone in 14 months, all from the same house, all last seen alone, all with rent paid in advance. He tried visiting the property but was turned away by Isidora herself, who stood in the doorway like a statue and told him, "This is a house of rest, not gossip." Still, he persisted. He bribed a neighbor boy to watch the house from the alley. What the boy reported was strange. Joaquin, the nephew, was often seen scrubbing the front step long after dark. Buckets of water, heavy sacks dragged through the corridor, a wood stove burning into the early morning hours, even in summer. Once, the boy claimed he saw a handprint on the upstairs window on the inside of the glass. It stayed there for days unmoved. Aguayo published a cautious article titled "Vacancy and Silence on Kilkenny." It drew little attention, but a week later, the boy he had paid disappeared. His mother said he had gone to sell newspapers and never returned. The same day, Aguayo received a package at his office. Inside was a small wooden box containing a single door key and a scrap of lace curtain shard at the edges. He went back to the police. This time, they listened. A constable and 2 assistants were dispatched to the boarding house. Under the pretense of a building inspection, Isidora greeted them calmly, offering tea. Joaquin was nowhere in sight. The officers inspected the rooms, 6 in total, each impeccably clean, sparsely furnished, and utterly lifeless. No personal belongings, no clothing, no dust. But the 7th door, the one at the end of the hall, was locked. Isidora claimed it was for storage, paint and brushes, she said, and mice. She jingled her keys, then told them she could not find the right one. The officers insisted. She became indignant, raised her voice, then, curiously, agreed. "Come back tomorrow," she said. "I will find the key." They never did. The next morning, the house stood silent. A "for rent" sign had been posted in the window. The door was unlocked, and the widow was gone. Inside, the rooms were still immaculate, but the 7th door now hung open. Behind it, a narrow staircase descending into the earth. The cellar was unlit, the air thick. At the bottom, officers found 3 iron bed frames, a small stove, and a series of trunks. Inside the trunks, clothing, documents, letters all belonging to the missing, and something else. Scraps of fabric twisted into cords, finger bones wrapped in rosary beads, a ledger with names neatly crossed out, including Aguayo. His name was 3rd from the bottom. Isidora Valverde was never found, nor was Joaquin. No official charges were filed. The boarding house was demolished a year later. But even today, some in Buenos Aires claim to hear the sound of keys jangling on quiet nights near Kilkenny, followed by silence and the soft click of a lock sliding into place. The cellar beneath the house on Kilkenny was unlike anything investigators in Buenos Aires had seen before, not for its horror, but for its cold precision. There was no blood, no scattered bones, no frantic signs of struggle. It was too clean. The beds were made, The trunks were stacked, and in the far corner, someone had left a small vase with a single dried rose. It felt more like a mausoleum. Then a crime scene, asterisk at the center of it all lay the ledger, leather-bound, with brass corners and initials pressed faintly into the cover. Each page bore a name, a date of arrival, and 3 columns: paid, compliance, and resolved. Every one of the entries was marked with check marks in black ink, precise, uniform, dated. The final page had only 2 names remaining: Aguayo, Hernan, and beneath it, written more recently, Franco, Tomas, the neighbor boy who had watched the house. Asterisk the discovery set off a quiet panic within the city. Newspapers published brief, sanitized accounts. Strange burial vault in boarding house cellar. Read one headline. Another simply said, woman and nephew missing, no foul play confirmed. Behind the scenes, officials argued. Some believed Isadora and Joaquin had fled by boat to Montevideo. Others suggested something darker, that they had been watching the watchers and left before the trap was fully set. Asterisk a city inspector named Dario Monclova was assigned to compile a report. A methodical man, he read every page of the ledger, cross-checked names with work permits, union rolls, and church records. He found that of the 18 names listed in the ledger, 13 were officially unaccounted for, 2 had been declared dead. From unrelated cousins, 3, including Aguayo, were still alive but had received anonymous warnings to cease inquiries. Aguayo himself had left Buenos Aires. Where to, no one knew. Asterisk, but Monclova noticed something odd. The dates listed under compliance were not random. They all fell on Mondays, each a multiple of 3 weeks after the previous arrival. It seemed mechanical, routine, almost ritual, and there was more. Each date coincided with deliveries to the boarding house: coal, soap, flour, but with one anomaly: the recurring delivery of thick rope from a hardware supplier in La Boca every 3 weeks, enough to tie down a mule. Asterisk Monclova visited the shop. The records confirmed the deliveries, paid in cash by a boy matching Joaquin's description. When asked what the rope was for, the owner shrugged. They said they needed it to tie up luggage during wet weather. It rains a lot here. No one questions rope, asterisk, but Monclova did. He returned to the cellar that same week. This time, he brought a stone mason. Beneath one of the beds, they found loose tiles. Beneath those soft soil, the smell was faint, but unmistakable. They stopped digging after 1 foot. What they found confirmed the city's worst fears: remains, tangled in knotted cloth, twisted around what had once been a neck. The report was written, filed, stamped, and quietly shelved. Asterisk why? Perhaps because too many names in the ledger were immigrants, men, without family, without citizenship, without voices. Perhaps the city feared what full investigation might uncover: not just the bodies, but the system that had let them vanish without notice. The case was closed, officially. No further evidence. The house was sold to a developer, demolished. The land paved into a side alley used by laundry carts and stray dogs. Asterisk, but not everyone forgot. Asterisk in 1918, 15 years later, a series of letters arrived at the Biblioteca Nacional in Buenos Aires, each signed with the initials JV. They contained short stories, fictional accounts. It seemed of a widow and her adopted son who ran a guest house for men who would not be missed. Each story ended the same way: their belongings burned, their voices gone, but the rent always paid. The stories were never published, but the librarians preserved them in a special folio, marked Origines Oscuros, Dark Origins. Asterisk one local historian, decades later, believed those stories were confessions, that Joaquin had survived, that he had learned to write, that perhaps he felt guilt or simply the need to leave a record. If so, they were the only surviving trace. No official photograph of Isidora Valverde remains. No grave, no death certificate, only whispers. And the fact that the alley behind Kale Seat is still referred to, even today, as La Boca del Silencio, the mouth of silence, asterisk, and in the oldest boarding houses of Buenos Aires, some landladies still hang a small brass key above the front desk, tied to a piece of black lace. A reminder, perhaps, that some doors should never be opened. and that some families kept more than just house. Asterisk when the boarding house on Kilkenny was finally torn down in the spring of 1905. No protest was made, no one petitioned to preserve it, and no surviving relatives came to collect what was left. The demolition crew noted only one unusual thing: the walls were unnaturally thick. Behind the plaster, they found layers of fabric-hold drapes, rugs, even mattress stuffing nailed into the studs as if to muffle sound. She wanted silence. One worker said, "Not peace, silence." Asterisk but silence, like truth, doesn't always stay buried. Asterisk after the demolition, the land sat unused for several years. Rumors circulated that workers refused to build on it. One construction foreman left after a week, claiming he heard footsteps at night and found a tenant logbook nailed to a beam, even though no wood from the old house had been salvaged. Another man claimed he heard a woman humming on the lot low and soft, a lullaby with no words. Eventually, the lot was paved over. Today, it's a delivery lane between a bakery and an apartment tower. Most people pass without noticing the small tile embedded in the wall, marked with only the letter V asterisk, but someone remembered. In 1924, a set of documents arrived anonymously at El Diario de la Tarde, the very paper where Hernan Aguayo had once worked. Inside, receipts, dozens of them, rent payments, all signed by Isidora Valverde. Many bore dates after the supposed closing of the house. Some listed tenant names long presumed dead, and one the final slip in the folder was for Unit 7. 3 weeks advance, received in full, dated October 1904. The name on that slip, J. Valverde. Asterisk had Joaquin continued the work after Isidora vanished? Had he assumed her identity, her methods, her rules, or was it something older, still something passed down generation to generation, not just in blood, but in silence? Historians debated quietly, but no official conclusions were drawn. The documents were filed away in a government archive, under cases unresolved, private residential, but privately. Some agreed Joaquin hadn't vanished. He had dissolved into the alleys, into the system, into new names. Perhaps he had learned how to run a boarding house more discreetly. Perhaps he passed his rules along to someone else, someone who knew that rent should always be paid in advance, that doors should lock from the outside, and that compliance was the only measure of safety. Asterisk in the decades that followed, more disappearances occurred throughout the city, often from boarding houses near docks, in slums, in districts where records were poorly kept. A pattern to loose to prove, to spread to contain, but always the same elements: cheap rent, quiet owners, rules posted in multiple languages, and an unusual smell around the stoves. One tenant, a young Italian mason, wrote to his sister before vanishing, "The landlady reminds me of someone. She doesn't speak, but I hear her humming. I can't place the tune. Still, I think I've heard it before in a dream, or a warning." Asterisk that letter was found unopened in her drawer a month later, postmarked but never mailed. Asterisk as for Kilkenny, it became one of those streets that older residents avoid mentioning. Maps list it, taxis drive past it, but no one lives there anymore. Not truly. And if they do, they keep the windows shut and the doors chained, just in case. Asterisk just in case sure he is still listening. Asterisk because some families kill together not for bloodlust or wealth or even cruelty, but because that's how they learn to survive. And when silence is passed down like an heirloom, it's hard to tell where tradition ends and murder begins. Asterisk